this morning's seminar is a special one. It was proposed prior to the MH17 disaster, so I think that these three gentlemen who have cooked this up together, I think starting with it, and I not cooked up the disaster, started with the paragraph at that point. So I think this began with an idea from Emeritus Professor Alan Ward, who's joined by Associate Professor Roger Markwick and esteemed Doctor Sacha to speak to us about something that obviously requires crucial context at the moment. And I think it's terrific that the series begins with a topic that demonstrates so clearly how much it matters to have an historical context.
We thought indeed that this whole crisis, especially the responses of our Australian politicians to it, deserves some context, and the purpose of the seminar is to offer that context. I'm going to rattle through very quickly, I hope, a proposition against the supported proposition, looking at history through a looking glass from a Russian perspective, and arguing that Russia is extremely distrustful of the West and difficult to deal with because it has been invaded from the West no less than 5 or 6 times in the last 200 years. The reverse has not happened. We begin with, of course, Napoleon's invasion of 1812. Professor Dwyer can elucidate all the way up to Europe, all the way to Moscow. Moscow burnt by the Russian citizenry themselves, Napoleon forced to retreat. But the event deep in Russian consciousness. We jump to 1854-56 when Britain and France again attacked Russia in the Crimea. You might remember the Crimean War from school history. The charge of the Light Brigade, cannons to left of them, cannons to right of them, volleyed and thundered into the valley of death, rode the 600. And Florence Nightingale, who toiled to relieve the misery of the troops, could not save them from cholera. Why were Britain and France in Crimea in 1853? A ludicrous dispute over the custody of the holy places in Jerusalem was casus belli. But the real reason was imperialism. It was because Britain and France wanted to control the Mediterranean. The French were building their empire in Algeria, Morocco, and it went on from there. The British wanted control of the Mediterranean largely because of their access to the route to India. They did not want Russia to control either the Mediterranean and were prepared to invade to prevent Russia even having control of the Black Sea. The British and French expeditionary force goes to the Crimea, so prepared to support the monstrous rule of the Turks over the Christian peoples of the region in order to keep Russia out. The war was a miserable failure from the point of view of Britain and France, and they retreated in some ignominy, leaving Russia still in control of the Crimea, which it had held since 1783. We jump to 1878, where the Christian peoples, Greeks, Serbs, Croats, Romanians, Bulgars, rose up against Turkish rule. They were supported by Orthodox Christian Russia, who attacked and defeated the Turks. Once again, the British sprang to arms, and I move to a brief account by the great Whig historian H.A.L. Fisher, whose History of Europe many of you may still have on your bookshelves, and which is still remarkably reliable. What Fisher has to say is that as far as the British and the British entry was concerned, In England, where the old Crimean spirit was much alive among the Tories, the Russian victories were received with a frenzy of indignant alarm. That Turkey should become a satellite of Russia seemed to imperil the whole position of Britain in the East. The Queen, the metropolitan press, the upper 10,000, British ruling class, were warlike. A silly song. We don't want to fight, but by jingo if we do, we've got the ships, we've got the men, we've got the money too. And that's the origin of the term jingoism, which is now freely thrown about, not least by some of our own politicians. Never was Europe closer, goes on Fisher, to a greater conflagration than in the early spring of 1878, when Lord Beaconsfield Cabinet came to Parliament for £6 million of money, ordered the fleet to pass through the Dardanelles into the Black Sea, called out the reserves. Even Salisbury, who felt that Russia could never seriously menace Britain's position in the Mediterranean. The peace of Europe was happily saved was due to the good offices of Bismarck, to the brilliant dexterity of Salisbury, and to the readiness of Austria to follow the British lead. The Congress of Berlin, chaired by Bismarck, of course, relieved the tension and arranged for the liberation of some of those small Slav peoples from Turkish rule. There's an echo of history here. I wonder if another German Chancellor will come to our rescue in the current crisis. Moving on through the saga, we come to 1914. And by now the struggle between Germanic peoples and Slavonic peoples has started to become the default position, particularly in this instance in the mind of the leader of the German military, Count von Moltke, who was aware of a Russian plan of mobilization which would come to fruition in 1917 and believed that the Germanic peoples had to strike first. So supporting Austria in the crisis over the assassination of the Archduke, the war began. I don't need to dwell on that, I don't think. The war came to an end and quickly dissolved into a civil war between the Bolsheviks, who seized power in 1917, the Reds versus the Whites in Russia. Once again, the West intervened. An expeditionary force, the British, French, were now joined by Americans and Czechs and Japanese in the Far East, tried to intervene on behalf of the Whites in order to bring Russia back into the war against Germany. That again is a detailed story, but the war was of course won by the Reds under the brilliant leadership of Leon Trotsky. And broadly speaking, the USSR, the Union of Socialist Republics, assumed sovereignty and control over the totality of former Tsarist Russia. The next crisis that loomed was the rise of Nazi Germany. To avenge Versailles and strike back, first at France and then turn eastward to strike at Russia. The Russians were aware of this threat. Their foreign minister was a brilliant man named Litvinov. It's his nom de guerre. His real name was Finkelstein. Of course, he was Jewish and disliked by Stalin for that reason. Litvinov worked very hard to promote what was called collective security that is to try to contain Nazi Germany through the League of Nations. He succeeded in getting USA and Germany too actually onto the League of Nations. And there was some hope that in the late 20s and early 30s this strategy might succeed. But they were betrayed, and I use the word deliberately. Russia felt betrayed, Litvinov felt betrayed at Munich, because the British preferred the ruling class again, Edward VIII, the Cliveden sect, all those people who entertained Ribbentrop and the like, found it more congenial to work with Germans than with Russians, once again. And the Munich decisions of late 1939 betrayed not only Czechoslovakia but Litvinov's strategy. Stalin then dismissed Litvinov and put Molotov in his place, the hardliner, which we know in our own lifetimes. World War II, of course, commenced within weeks of the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. There was, I think, a further betrayal of the Russians because Britain, in particular, stubbornly refused to open the second front against Germany in 1943, as Stalin was desperately begging, deferred till 1944. Even though the American generals were willing to strike at Germany through southern France in 1943. The British had a miserable memory of the First World War, and Churchill was reluctant. And so the war went on, with Russia bearing the most appalling cost. The figures have been rising. Lately, it's calculated that some 27 million Russians died in the Second World War under the Nazi onslaught. And so did, of course, most of the Jews and many of the Slavs in regions like Ukraine. At the hands of Nazi death squads, supported by death squads of Ukrainians, Lithuanians and such like. In that climate, the Americans began to develop the atomic bomb, hoping to bring the war to an end against both Japanese and Germans. They had the bomb ready to use after Germany had surrendered in May 45. There was a Potsdam conference in July 1945, attended by Cuban and Russia and Stalin, Churchill. Yet many of the atomic scientists, as you probably know, were so fearful of this tremendous weapon, they believed that it ought to be shared with the world community under United Nations aegis, not kept in the hands of just the Americans or the West. But in the end, the Americans decided not to do that. So Truman went to the Potsdam Conference with the knowledge that they had the bomb ready to use against the Japanese, but did not tell Stalin. Unfortunately, from the Western perspective, Stalin knew they had the bomb, thanks to the brilliance of the espionage system led by Klaus Fuchs, a notorious traitor. So Stalin knew he was being deceived at Potsdam. Yet another betrayal by the West is how the Russians would perceive that. They began to prepare their own nuclear scientists to counter the threat. Well, the bombs were dropped on Japan, the war with Japan came to an end. But meanwhile, there's a little note going around. The Pentagon, the Air Supremos of the Pentagon, asked General Groves, who was the head of the Manhattan Project of the building of the atomic bombs, how many bombs would be needed to take Russia out of the conflict, potential conflict with the West, in the way that the Japanese had apparently been taken out by bombs on the Russian Nagasaki. The calculation was that something like, pages blurred, 193 bombers would be needed to wipe out most of the Russian cities. They're listed there, but General Groves, the Air Force decided that probably only 15 Russian cities would need to be destroyed in order to force Stalin and Soviet Russia back down. This too was known in the Crimea because of the espionage. You see, I'm trying to build a picture of why the Russians, particularly communist Russians, would utterly distrust the West. And we went into the Cold War with all the horrors that entailed. Yes, the Russians had gone to the West this time. They'd taken Berlin, and we rejoiced in it. But they stayed during the Cold War, and the West did not like that at all. So I'll do this quickly. We lived in this strange world for about a decade of atomic preparations on either side of the world, and the threat of nuclear war, the Dr. Strangelove era, which was, in a small miracle, brought largely to an end during the Cuban Missile Crisis by the President John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev of Russia, who decided they had to pull back from this horrendous brink. And the period of relaxation that followed was truly remarkable. We are fortunate to have grown up with it in most of our lifetimes. The Soviet Union itself came to an end in December 1991. We've assumed in the West that this great monstrous monolith which stretched from Moscow to Berlin was almost unchallengeable. In fact, the analysis now, my colleagues can correct me if this is wrong, is that the Russians, Russia, the core of the Russian state was overstretched heavily, and that the whole thing was more fragile than we in the West were aware for a long time. And it only took the beginnings of revolts in Poland, that Mensa and his movement, and revolt in Germany rising in Leipzig, which spread over through Germany to bring down the Berlin Wall, bring about the reunification of Germany. The whole edifice collapsed remarkably quickly. It collapsed so quickly that there was no time for any serious readjustment of boundaries between the former Soviet socialist republics, which now, all of a sudden, found themselves as independent sovereign states. Among those was Ukraine, which had been, up until late 1991, just one of the Soviet socialist republics, all ruled from Moscow. So Ukraine as a sovereign state is relatively new on the scene. All went well for quite some time. The first president of Ukraine, Leonid Kuchma, deserves credit for joining in the support for the SALT Treaty, which ended the nuclear arms race and resulted in an agreement between America and Russia to remove all nuclear weapons from Ukraine. As far as we know, that has been adhered to. They formed what we now have quite a lot about, the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is an alternative that Russia prefers to work through rather than the UN, which it sees as Western dominated and altogether too prone to be a tool of NATO, which was the military alliance against the old Soviet Union, and which has moved steadily eastward. When the Soviet Union dissolved and allowed German unification, my understanding is that the Russians understood that NATO was not supposed to move further eastward, but it did, and the Baltic republics are now also part of NATO, and the crisis that's erupted in Ukraine, as you know, is partly attributed to the struggle between Russia and the West over whether Ukraine will be brought into the eastern and the western zone of power, economic power, and possibly military power. So I think I've used my time up, and leave you with that outline. You can come back to some much in detail if need be, but I will leave one further thought. One of the unsung heroes of the dissolution of the aggressive Russia is Boris Yeltsin. We tend to underestimate him because he was an alcoholic, and he's shown often stewing drunkenly around banquets. But Yeltsin, all through the 1990s, fought a long, hard struggle to defeat the Communist Party influence in Russia, and succeeded. The Russian Duma is an important part of the Russian constitution. It is a presidential system. It is not a dictatorship. It is not altogether different in formal structure, at least from that of the United States. And who was one of the agents of bringing down the destruction of the Communist Party? It was the so-called dictator, Mr. Vladimir Putin, who formed a new political party, United Russia, and won, first of all, the democratic election for the prime ministership, and then a democratic election for the presidency. And that's where we are.
Okay, so what I'd like to do today is to discuss how Russian and Ukrainian nationalists have been using historical narratives to legitimize their position in this ongoing struggle in the region. And I'm not talking just in terms of the context of the current civil war that's going on within the Ukraine. I'm talking about a longer-term tensions between Russia on one side and the Ukraine on the other over the extent of Russian or Western influence in the Ukraine. Okay. And I'm looking at how Russian and Ukrainian nationalists have used these historical narratives to both legitimize their position and also to attempt to gain international sympathy for their cause. I'm particularly interested in that. The messages that they are trying to convey to the broader international world. I won't be attempting to assert the rightness or wrongness of these historical claims of either side. Okay? I shall leave that to my more stalwart colleagues to do. Rather, what I aim to do is to highlight the process by which the history of the region has been instrumentalized, and to sketch out how that influences the current conflict. And my starting point, I guess, is with the collapse of the Soviet Union, because new states invariably produce their own national historical narratives, in part as an act of legitimization, justifying why they are and why they are entitled to their own states. And the post-Soviet states have been no exception to that, including both Ukraine and Russia. Russia benefited from being able to draw upon an already well-developed imperial Russian or Soviet historical narrative. Okay. And it also benefited from the fact that the Russian historical narrative dominates Western historical narratives of the region. Okay. Now that might sound a little counterintuitive, given as Alan has just told us there's a great deal of tension between Russia and the West. But if you think about it, if you were to look for courses on this part of the world in universities throughout Europe, throughout the West more generally, including this university here, you would find they are taught through the framework of courses on Russian history or on Russian-dominated Soviet history. You would struggle to find many courses, for example, teaching the history of the area in terms of, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, for example, or other such structures. The Ukrainian nationalist narrative, on the other hand, suffers a number of challenges. One is that the Ukrainians, as Alan has mentioned, have a very limited history in before 1991 of statehood, particularly in the modern period. There was a brief Ukrainian state between 1917 and 1918. It didn't technically last longer, but I think by the end of 1918 it ceased to be an effective political unit. But apart from that, that's pretty much it. Which means that Ukrainian nationalists face a double challenge. Firstly, formulating a national historical narrative that legitimizes the Ukrainian state, and secondly, disseminating that narrative in the West. Now, I should also make clear that the universities and history departments in Russia and the Ukraine are vibrant, exciting places, okay, where all sorts of different historical perspectives are being discussed, where the same new histories that since the 1960s have so opened up historical debate in universities in Australia and elsewhere, have since the 1990s opened up the debate in Ukraine and Russia as well. Okay, so within the academy, Ukrainian and Russian history is not limited to a kind of nationalist perspective. However, that broader historiographical debate has relatively little impact on public perceptions of Russian history and public perceptions of Ukrainian history in those countries. That's the first thing. And secondly, that broader debate has had very little impact at all on the ways in which the nationalists from the two countries sell their political, their viewpoints, attempt to legitimize them in the public discourse. So I'm not looking at that sophisticated academic debate as is occurring within the universities themselves. I'm looking at the public discourse, particularly the attempts to sway public opinion in the English language press in those two countries. Okay? And the sources I'm concentrating on, in a sense, today, given my limited time, firstly, the website of Russia Today, an English language television station that is widely perceived to be closely linked to the Cuban government. And secondly, Ukrainian Week, the English language publication of a similarly titled Ukrainian publication that is closely aligned to the Euromaidan protesters against the Yanukovych government. It emerged following the Orange Revolution, and it's now closely aligned to the new government that came to power in 2014 in the Ukraine. Okay, so what are the messages, in brief, that the national narratives that the two sides wish to convey? The Ukrainian national historical narrative is one in which the long-term historical trajectory of the Ukraine has been towards Europe, towards the West, and away from Russia in the East. Okay? And this argument is very typical from the arguments that one sees from nationalists right through Central and Eastern Europe. Okay? Nationalists of all varieties in Central and Eastern Europe tend to argue that we, in my country, are Western, and they, in that country over there, they're all Eastern. Okay? And indeed, you can find that argument right across. Okay? The Russian national narrative is quite different. Okay? From imperial times, from Tsarist times, the Russian national narrative has argued that Russia is a great civilization in its own right, distinct from and frequently in opposition to the West. Okay? And that the lands around it belong to the same civilization. Okay, especially the so-called near abroad, those countries that were formerly part of the Soviet Union. Okay? And it's interesting to note that Western historical narratives adopt a very similar line to the Russian line. That is, in Western narratives, there tends to be an assumption that the East is somehow essentially different. Okay? It's not like the West. Okay, so how does this debate play out in these publications? Well, both Russian and Ukrainian nationalists see the origins of their state, their culture, in the ancient state of Kievan Rus. They're founded in the late 9th century by Swedish Vikings who, instead of heading westwards to invade the British Isles and France and Germany, went eastwards down the great river systems of Eastern Europe. They conquered the predominantly Slavic tribes that they found there and established a series of city-states roughly under the rule of the greatest city-state, Kiev. Okay. They converted to Orthodox Christianity in 988 CE, and this state basically survived until it disintegrated under the pressure of the expanding Mongols in the 13th century. Okay. Now, in the Russian national narrative, first I should note that in the north, the Duchy of Muscovy, one of these states, survived as a satellite of the Mongol Khanate. Okay? And this is the core of what eventually became the state of Russia. The Russian national narrative emphasizes that Russia was the successor of Kievan Rus, that the civilization that began in Kievan Rus was preserved in Russia, okay? And that indeed Kievan Rus was a Russian state. Okay? The Ukrainian narrative takes a different view and argues that the core of Kievan Rus was actually around Kiev itself, in the south, in what is now the modern Ukraine. And that thus the Ukraine is the true successor to Kievan Rus, that the Ukraine embodies that civilization. Okay? In fact, the Ukrainian weak goes even further in this argument, arguing that it was the Vikings who brought their freedom-loving traditions of the West with them to this region, and this is the beginning of the true Westernness of the Ukrainians. Okay? And instead, the Ukrainian weak assures us the Russians culturally are their cultural legacy comes from the Mongols, with its tradition of absolutism, and is completely in contrast to the views of the West. Now, from an external perspective, it's tempting to say, well, couldn't you just share the influence? Couldn't you all be successors of Kievan Rus? And indeed, Russia today makes this argument, that Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians all share this common cultural heritage and religious heritage. Okay? However, the Ukrainian weak sees this as a terrible trap. Okay? And it does so because from Tsarist imperial times, the argument that these lands shared a common heritage was frequently used in justification for extending Russian rule over these territories. Okay? So, as far as the contributors to Ukrainian weak are concerned, this is a trap, justifying increased Russian influence, and it is something that they strongly oppose. Okay, now, the Duchy of Moscow was not the only state to emerge from Kievan Rus. With the collapse of Kievan Rus, the western portions of the Ukraine were incorporated into the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Okay, and here is the Commonwealth at its height. Now, the Russian view, the Russian narrative view, is that Polish rule meant foreign alien domination. Okay, and the Treaty of Pereyaslav in 1654, which began the process by which these Ukrainian lands began to come under the rule of Moscow. These are viewed in Russia as the beginning of the process of reunification, reuniting the little Russians, the Ukrainians, with the great Russians, the Russians. Okay? And indeed, Khrushchev honoured the 300th anniversary of this treaty by granting Crimea to the Ukraine in 1954. The Ukrainians take a different view. They argue that under the Poles, the Ukrainians maintain their autonomy and their own institutions within Poland. That this was not a period of foreign domination, this was a period in which their political, their cultural and their religious connection to the West was strengthened by association with Poland, by the influence of Western Christianity. Okay. Ukrainian weak goes further. It assures us that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was also an act of economic union with the West, thus being a predecessor to the Ukraine's future economic union with the European Union. That's an interesting argument, to say the least. Okay. Russian rule was not an act of reunification, according to the Ukrainian nationalist narrative. Rather, it was the colonization of the Ukraine, first by Imperial Russia and secondly by the Soviet Union. And it's important to note that in the Ukrainian nationalist narrative, the Soviet Union is specifically a Russian institution, okay, that reflects Russian, that is Mongol, that is authoritarian political values, and thus is alien to the Ukrainian, the Western Ukraine. Okay.
for Ukrainians, the greatest example of the Russian, that is, the Soviet, that is, Russian domination is, of course, the Holodomor. Okay, the Great Famine of 1932 to 1933, caused by Stalin's collectivization process, which led to millions of deaths. The Ukrainian term Holodomor, I think, can literally be translated to hunger deaths, or extermination by hunger. Okay. And in the Ukrainian nationalist narrative, this was genocide. A genocide specifically aimed at the Ukrainians, okay, and carried out by the Soviets, that is, by the Russians. Now, the Russian nationalist narrative is somewhat different. The narrative doesn't deny the occurrence of, Russians do not deny the occurrence of the famine, of the terrible cost it had, okay, but they hotly deny that this was genocide. Okay. They hotly deny that it was specifically targeted at Ukrainians, although they accept that many Ukrainians perished, and instead they argue that the term Holodomor ignores the many non-Ukrainian victims, many of whom were not even in the Ukraine. Okay. And indeed, Russia Today highlights in its articles that some Ukrainian communist officials were involved in putting through the collectivization and thus were involved in this process, and this was not somehow a specifically Russian process, rather a Soviet process. In return, Ukrainian Week publishes articles explaining how prominent Ukrainian communists were coerced into collaborating with this process and did not do so willingly. I should mention that not all of the Ukraine was in interwar in the Soviet Union during the interwar period. The Western Ukraine was within Poland. And the Ukrainian national narrative traditionally treats this, or traditionally since 1991, traditionally and earlier in the Western Ukraine, in the Ukrainian diaspora in the West, treats this period of Polish rule as a further period of colonization and oppression. It's interesting to note that the Ukrainian Week doesn't really take that angle. And I think that's because it relies on the Poles, amongst others, as its allies in the European Union that hopefully will sponsor its future membership, which seems to be the aim of most Ukrainian nationalists. Rather, the Ukrainian Week emphasizes another element of the Ukrainian nationalist narrative, that is that Polish rule reinforced the Westernness of Western Ukraine. And indeed, Ukrainian Week describes the Soviet occupation of these regions during the Second World War as, and I quote, a barbarian invasion. Okay. While the Ukrainian Week concentrates on this broad sweep of history, Russia Today concentrates on a specific period of this history, that is the Second World War, the interwar period in the Second World War, and particularly the activities of the quasi-fascist OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and its military wing, the UPA, the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. Okay. During the Second World War, the OUN became allies of Nazi Germany in the hope of establishing a Ukrainian satellite state after the war, okay, or even during the war. This was a misguided aim. When the OUN attempted to declare an independent Ukrainian state in alliance with Germany, Germany cracked down and arrested the OUN leaders responsible. Okay. Nonetheless, the UPA fought with Germany against the Red Army, and later on fought against Germany as well, but certainly fought against the Red Army, and it continued a guerrilla war against the Soviet Union after the end of the war in 1945, right through till 1949. Now, in the post-communist period, there's been considerable memorialization of the OUN and the UPI in the Ukraine. Okay. In 2010, the then President Viktor Yushchenko declared the OUN, one of the key leaders of the OUN, Stepan Bandera, to be a hero of the nation. Okay, and there are numerous memorials to him, and this was highly disputed within the Ukraine, but in part within the Ukraine, but especially from outside of the Ukraine. There was an international outcry, in part because, as Alan has indicated, the UPA had played a significant role a support role in the Holocaust, okay, as well as other acts of ethnic cleansing. For example, the ethnic cleansing of large numbers of Poles Western modern day Ukraine. Okay. As a result of this outcry, Yushchenko, no, not as a result of this outcry. In 2010, as it happens, Yushchenko lost his office to the recently ousted President Viktor Yanukovych, and Yanukovych, whose support base is in the party regions, which tends to draw its support from the Russian-speaking areas, annulled the title, this title hero of the nation. Okay. And in a broader sense, the Russian response to the memorialization of the OUN and Bandera has been one of great opposition, because it's seen as an insult to the Russian narrative of the Great Patriotic War. Okay? The idea that the OUN were resistance fighters resisting against Russian invasion completely contradicts the Russian view that the Red Army was engaged in great sacrifices to liberate Ukraine from Nazism. Okay. And Russia today has published numerous articles highlighting the UPA ethnic cleansing of Poles in Western Ukraine and the role of the UPA in the Holocaust. The Ukrainian response, well, as I indicated, or the Ukrainian week's response, as I indicated, the decision to commemorate Bandera was controversial even in the Ukraine. You wouldn't know that from reading Ukrainian Week. Okay. Ukrainian Week emphasizes that the alliance with Nazi Germany was necessary, that the Ukrainians were a small stateless people trapped between Nazi Germany on one side and Stalinist Russia on the other. Okay. The Ukrainian Week distances the UPA from the Holocaust and also attempts to highlight the small number of Russian collaborators with Nazism as evidence that this was not somehow a specifically Ukrainian thing. Okay, so these very broadly are the outlines of the historical debate. Why does it matter? How does it impact on the current dispute? Well, while written to persuade, the historical narratives in RT and the Ukrainian Week are more than simply propaganda. They reflect the deeply held views on both sides. For Ukrainian nationalists, their historical narrative reinforces and legitimizes their separateness from Russia, their belonging to the West, but also the lingering influence of Russification, that is, and Sovietization, colonization by Russia. Okay. In the Ukrainian Week, which remember is associated with the opposition parties, President Viktor Yanukovych and his government was characterized as being political cronyism, as paying only lip service to democracy, as being highly connected to a new oligarchy of old nomenclatura, now economic pirates governing the country. And worse than that, these characteristics are all Russian characteristics in tension to the Ukraine's Western democratic traditions extending all the way back to Viking times. Okay. And I think this helps explain the explosive Euromaidan response when Yanukovych attempted to move away from closer ties to the European Union and towards closer ties with Russia. From the Russian perspective, on the other hand, the Ukraine is part of the near abroad. It shares a common culture. And Western influences on the Ukraine are not good things. They are examples of moral corruption, and especially of sexual immorality. Okay. For example, Russia Today has published numerous articles on Western sex tourism in the Ukraine. Okay, as evidence of the influence of closer ties with the West. It means Western men coming and paying money to have sex with Ukrainian women. Russia Today has also taken great offence at the Femen movement. This is a feminist protest movement that makes striking protests, and in order to gain as much media publicity for these protests, they carry out these protests. Well, initially they carried out these protests being rather scantily dressed, with their messages written on their body. In more recent years, they tend to do this topless, because they found that it's amazing how much more media attention you can get the less clothes you wear. Okay? And here we have a protest by women in the Femen movement against the sex tourism trade from Western Europe. Okay? As far as the Russia Today is concerned, this is further evidence of the moral decay caused by Western influences. Okay? Several Femen protests have been targeted against the Orthodox Church for some particularly strikingly statements that were particularly strikingly not in favour of women's liberation, and this disrespect for Christian orthodoxy is further evidence in Russia today of the moral decay caused by the West. Okay. Now, RT's coverage also reflects and reinforces the Russian perspective that Ukrainian nationalism is extremist, xenophobic, and deeply anti-Russian. That is, that Ukrainian nationalism is the fascism of the OUN in the eyes of the Russian, from the Russian historical narrative. And RT pays particularly close attention to the far-right party Svoboda, which played or Freedom, which played a key role in the Euromaidan protests. It's not the largest party by any means in the new government or involved in the protests, but this far-right party includes the most active and potentially violent individuals of the protest movement. So in a sense, they formed the shock troops of Euromaidan. Okay, and RT covers their actions very closely. For example, one politician who visited a kindergarten in Kiev, I believe in Kiev, I'm not certain of the exact location off the top of my head, and allegedly railed against those children who referred to themselves by the Russian version of their name instead of the Ukrainian version of their name because it was showing a lack of Ukrainian pride. Okay. Now, we should note that the Russian speakers within the Ukraine, the Russian-speaking East, is largely made up of descendants of industrial workers who migrated there during Stalin's industrialization process. Okay, and they're less attracted to Ukrainian national narratives, more attracted to the Soviet narratives and Russian narratives of the Great Patriotic War. Okay, and this is where Yanukovych's party of regions drew its support base primarily from these regions. They do not emphasize Ukrainian nationalist rhetoric, and they're alienated by the post-Maidan, Euromaidan emphasis on Ukrainian nationalism. Now, the Ukrainian nationalist narrative is deeply hostile towards these Russian speakers in the southeastern Ukraine. Okay? And we need to note that in Western Europe, when we talk about minority rights, we talk about minority rights in the context of human rights. Okay? In Eastern Europe, where the borders are more fragile, where the populations are more mixed, they talk about human rights primarily in the context of national security. That is this minority and its demands a threat to our state? And the Ukrainian, as far as the Ukrainian week is concerned, Russian-speaking Ukrainians are evidence of the internal mental colonization of the Ukrainians by Russia. Okay? And thus, Russian speakers are a danger to the nation. More than that, even being bilingual, being able to speak Russian as well as Ukrainian is a bad thing because it shows this kind of internal colonization. Okay? Now, Russian speakers, by and large, are not being oppressed in their speaking, their ability to use their language. But the position of Ukrainian week, this is the Democratic paper, one of the Democratic papers, one of the pro-Western papers, is indicative of the levels of tension over language use. Okay. Overall, and I should finish up because I'm getting that you should finish up look from the chair. Overall, these tensions over the history of the region suggest that conflict in the Ukraine has deep roots, and that these deep roots will be a complex and difficult process to resolve.
Well, my talk is very much concentrated on contemporary history, looking at really recent events, events in particular since round about November 2013, so very much is focused on the contemporary situation. A situation, of course, exacerbated by the destruction of the Malaysian airliner MH17 and the resultant loss of nearly 300 innocent lives over eastern Ukraine. Lots of Western leaders, I use that term in inverted commas, not least our own Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, have made direct accusations at some stage or other that the rebels in the East Russian-speaking rebels, separatists in the eastern part of Ukraine, or Moscow itself were responsible for the destruction of that plane. They've not been alone in saying this, not least the former Ukrainian Prime Minister, Arseniy Yatsenyuk, denounced, in fact, immediately after the shooting down of that particular plane, denounced what he called Russian-led terrorists, bastards who committed this international crime against humanity, war against Ukraine, against Europe, against the world. So he really made this incident into an issue that is much larger than what is occurring, in fact, in eastern Ukraine. And he wasn't alone either. President Obama, US President Obama, likewise pointed his finger essentially at Russian separatists and by implication Moscow itself. In the wake of all that, mind you, all these accusations, not to put too fine a point on them, came before any investigation. So there's a kind of, but mildly, prejudgment going on here. But as we all know now, our foreign minister, presumably single-handedly, not quite, managed to get through a security resolution, number 216, on the downing of the MH17, and which called for a full, thorough and independent international investigation. Not many people realise, though, that Russia itself was actually pushing for an international investigation and an open investigation. And when push came to shove, they supported the resolution that finally went up to the Security Council. I'm actually running ahead of the story a little bit here, but let me just say that, in fact, in the course of the lead up to the adoption of that resolution, Russia itself posed questions, Moscow itself posed questions to Ukraine, and specifically asked questions in relation to the role of Ukrainian aircraft control and in relation to the deployment of anti-missile batteries and so forth. So that's not to say that, in fact, that's not to say that the rebels are necessarily exonerated in terms of the destruction of that plane. But it does pose questions in terms of, well, where does the real truth lie? And as we all know, especially in times of war, the truth is often the first casualty. And I suspect that may well be the case in this situation. Now, let me just try and quickly set the scene in terms of kind of sources that I see that are really driving this conflict at the moment. This map makes it clear that Ukraine is fairly much a divided nation in terms of... Is that right? Okay. So, these are the regions, and these are the regions in which are not entirely, but largely Russian speaking, tend to be, if they are religious, Church Slavonic. Here's the west of Ukraine, I should say, which tends to be, well, as we've already heard from Sacha, this is the area that regards itself particularly as Western oriented. These areas here, these regions here, particularly Donetsk and Luhansk, they look to, they're ethnically Russian in the main, Russian speaking in the main, and look to Russia, really identify with Russia at large. What can also be said, though, about those regions is that these are the eastern parts of Ukraine tend to be more industrialized, and for that reason have a stronger economic link with Russia itself. And note that Yanukovych, the former president of Ukraine, who was ousted in February of this year, actually drew a large part of his support through the Party of Regions from the eastern Ukraine. That was the backbone of his support. That is, amongst the Russian ethnic speakers, Russian ethnic populations of that region. But of course, it's not a simple division of west and east. There's a lot of intermingling of populations and so forth. Just one other point I think to be noted about both of the states that are in contest here in terms of Ukraine on the one hand, Russia on the other. And that is, it's not unimportant that they're post-Soviet states that both, in fact, in one way or other, saw the destruction of the old, highly centralized, highly authoritarian Soviet system, and on the back of that emerged very powerful, very wealthy, not necessarily law-abiding, in other words, corrupt, very wealthy, often as not men, that go by a sort of euphemism of oligarchs. So both of those states are characterized by that kind of political system. But an important distinction here is that in Russia, Putin's state has tended to be much more assertive and has tended to, in fact, to dominate, if anything, even jail. If you get on the wrong side of Putin's state, remember he's an ex-KGB officer, we can talk about that. Everybody knows what KGB officers do. So, in Russia, the state has tended to coexist with the oligarchs, these wealthy figures, but to a certain extent bring them to heel. But in Ukraine, the oligarchs, the wealthy, not least the latest president, Poroshenko, actually have a direct presence in the state. And in both cases, I think we see a corrupting influence on the part of, in terms of the political process, which opens up all sorts of opportunities in terms of the way politics is conducted, not least both internally and externally. But it also, too, explains, I think, the importance of Putin as a figure in this scenario, and why, often as not, he's seen as, well, the bad guy. Okay, so let me turn to the question of the immediate context. That context is, as has already been alluded to by both my co-speakers, but particularly Alan when he referred to the Russian fear of invasion, because there is no doubt in my mind that in good part, a lot of the crisis, and particularly Russia, Moscow's, if you like, response to the situation, their role in this, is driven by historical memory of what has previously occurred, particularly in terms of military invasion and the incredible consequences of that, not least in the Second World War. But coupled with that too, fear of European and or US economic influence in Ukraine. So what I can, to put it in a nutshell, I'd suggest that in many respects, Russia has been motivated by the fear that Ukraine will be drawn in to an economic union and a military alliance that in fact directly threatens Russia's strategic and economic interests. And that in good part explains why they have conducted themselves as they have. Well, I don't know whether I really need to spell out what's happening here in this particular map, but you can see very clearly that Russia is not expanding towards the west. On the contrary, as Alan has already alluded to, there is an alliance, and that alliance, I'm talking about a military alliance now, NATO, which in fact was very much part of the Cold War, and despite the fact that George Bush, HW I think, made promises to Gorbachev, the last leader of the Soviet Communist Party, that NATO would not extend, NATO would not extend its influence once Germany was united. In fact, some 9 former Warsaw Pact nations and 3 former Soviet republics have actually been incorporated into NATO. As you can see, effectively, the way in which Russia might see, not without reason, that there are there's a fairly well deployed military alliance right up to its borders. And if Ukraine was to join in that, that would be a serious strategic threat to Russia's interests. For that reason, though, in fact, we can say they'd already had a taste. In fact, Russia had already had a taste of what was possibly to come back in 2008. You might remember a small war in which Georgia was involved. And it seems like that was a test case for really to test Russia's resolve in relation to NATO. But here we can see, as far as the Russians are concerned, that NATO really, in many respects, represents a real and immediate military threat. I'm not suggesting war. What I'm suggesting is that this deployment really is something that Moscow would not afford to ignore. And it's particularly in that respect striking that, in fact, in November of 2013, when the EU was negotiating with Yanukovych, the former President of Ukraine, when the EU, the European Union, was discussing an association agreement, as it was called, in relation to free trade, a free trade agreement with Ukraine, that in fact there were little known, in fact maybe nobody knows about them other than the Russians and the Ukrainians, maybe the EU, there were in fact military clauses that called for the integration of Ukraine into EU defence structures, including cooperation, and I quote, cooperation on civilian and military crisis management operations. So the EU is not exactly an innocent partner in all of this. The real fear that Moscow has had is that a hostile Ukraine might displace Russia's, in particular, Russia in the Crimea, where in fact it still has, in Sevastopol, Black Sea naval base. That this might become a base that, for example, the US might be able to get control of, or it could provide a home to NATO. So, in many respects, the story of the Ukraine since the demise of the Soviet Union has been a tug of war between West and East, if you like, between Moscow, maybe Brussels, maybe Washington. So you can see that tug of war going on. And that tug of war has tended to shift according to whoever is the incumbent, particularly the president. Thus, for example, Ukraine's second president, Leonid Kuchma, who was president from 1994 to 1999, had good ties with Moscow, but he also tried to put the country on a European path. In fact, he wrote a book entitled, in 2003, Ukraine is not Russia. He was the first Ukrainian president to actually approach the European Union with the idea of signing an association agreement with Europe. Kuchma's successor, a chap by the name of Viktor Yushchenko, you saw his photograph earlier, who was president from 2005 to 10, and who actually come to power on the back of the so-called Orange Revolution of 2004, actually accelerated Ukraine's shift towards Europe. That shift, in many respects, though, came to an abrupt, well, I wouldn't say an abrupt halt, maybe a staggering halt, in 2010, when Viktor Yanukovych, who was ousted in February of this year, became president of Ukraine. Came to power on the back of a party entitled, which was called the Party of Regions. And he tended to shift Ukraine back towards Russia's orbit. He was autocratic, there's no doubt about that. He was he was corrupt. He seems to have owned a very big house with a lot of rooms, with a lot of things in them. But he was elected. And he was not alone in being corrupt. That's a feature, frankly, of the entire Ukrainian political class. But thieves don't really have much respect, and he went ahead and jailed the former Ukrainian Prime Minister, Yulia Tymoshenko, one of the leaders of the Orange Revolution, a very wealthy businesswoman in her own right. She was jailed for abuse of office and so forth, and released subsequent to Yanukovych being thrown out. Now, the immediate trigger for the crisis, though, that is unraveled, it continues to unravel, particularly in the east of Ukraine, is that in November of 2013, Yanukovych unexpectedly refused to sign an agreement with the EU, the association agreement. With good reason, because the conditions of that agreement, not only did it have these little military clauses in there, but it said basically you have to cut expenditure on oil and gas, you have to remove subsidies, you've got to repay your debts, the IMF money and so forth, that'll flow too, but you have to put in place stringent fiscal and budgetary measures to meet your debts and to meet the loans that you're in fact going to, that they were offered. Anybody who's been to Eastern Europe knows how cold it gets in winter. That's really a recipe for massive social upheaval. And in that respect, that was a bridge too far for Yanukovych. So, at that point, he balked, didn't put pen to paper, and into that space stepped President Putin, who offered, in fact, Ukraine $15 billion and a subsidised gas, subsidised supply of gas, on which, by the way, I might add, Ukraine is Russian gas, of course, on which Ukraine is heavily dependent. His decision, that is Yanukovych's decision to actually refuse to sign that agreement, really set the cat among the pigeons. I suppose that's a euphemism, because you would have seen, many of you, all that bloodshed on Euromaidan, the fighting that was going on. These were not just mass demonstrations, they were extremely violent. Some of the organisations that were involved in this, you mentioned, Sacha mentioned Svoboda, there's also another one called Pravdi Sector, Right Sector. These are movements that had an extremely militarist and military dimension to them from the very beginning. And just as a little aside, because it's almost as if conspiracies and intrigues operate in the politics of this part of the world, mind you, might have to look closer at home too, but it's just concentrated on Eastern Europe, Eastern Ukraine, the Ukraine and Russia. There were killings not only of ordinary people in the square, but killings too of the police that they were confronting. And I have read when I was in Russia in March of this year, speculation about where do these forces come from. So there are wheels within wheels in this process that, whether we ever get to the bottom of it, I don't know. But the point is, this created a situation in which, in fact, Yanukovych was forced to sign a compromise deal on the 21st of February with three opposition leaders, all of whom basically came from these extremely right-wing political movements whose lineage, in fact, or at least take some pride in their lineage in relation to Ukrainian nationalists, we saw, and more fascists that we saw before. So a deal was struck, and that deal would have allowed Yanukovych to actually step out to eventually transition out of power. There were going to be elections and so forth. There were Russians observing that process. I actually wondered whether it was a sort of mini Munich in a way. But in fact it was brokered by EU ambassadors and EU representatives. Next day, the very next day, Yanukovych was effectively driven out of power. The EU did not then say, you can't do that, we just had an agreement, that's illegitimate. On the contrary, they turned around and ratified that decision. And that, as far as I can see, was the critical moment for Moscow, because they could now see that a pro-Russian president was about to be ousted, was ousted, that the West would in fact bring in a figure, which they've done, Poroshenko, through electoral means, but nevertheless, the chocolate king, as he's called, well, not with live circles, I suppose. But Poroshenko leans decidedly towards the West. There's no doubt about that. So in that respect, Russians, or Moscow's worst fears have been realized. But it was on that basis then that Putin, who was open, for example, to a tripartite agreement with Yanukovych, which would have allowed the EU to have some sort of agreement with Kiev as well as Moscow. It was on the fact that that government, that Yanukovych was overturned, that the EU was actually complicit in that process, ratified that process, that he then, on that basis, then decided, right, we are going to reclaim the Crimea, as it's called. Because, and the pretext is ethnically Russian, say 85% of its peoples are ethnically, regard themselves as ethnically Russian, there are Tatars there and so forth. But, of course, Putin, I'm sure, in his heart of hearts, feels very a great degree of identification with these people, but really, I think it was the Sevastopol naval base that was really close to his heart. That's what he wanted. He could not afford to allow an important military and strategic base like that peninsula to fall into the hands of those he saw as his opponents. And in many respects then, the story has unfolded since then. Of course, the West, and then I'm using the term loosely, took exception to this. You can't use 19th century techniques of say, occupying other countries, annexing them and so forth. They annexed it, we know that. There was a referendum, and all of this was rejected by the West as 19th century politics and so forth. You're not allowed to do that kind of thing. You might use drones and so forth, but you're not allowed to send your troops into other people's countries like that. Nobody expected that from Putin. But I can tell you, domestically, it was a great winner for Putin. He became, in his country, things weren't looking so good domestically for him. But in fact, his stature within Russia, given his appeal to the patriotism, the patriotic sentiment of the populace, given his strong stance, given the fact that he was standing up to the West in particular, all of that really raised his stature. But at the same time, he raised the expectations of the separatist movements in the West that feared, in fact, like Moscow itself, that what they had in place in Kiev was a fascist, anti-Russian, and in some cases anti-communist movement. That was a threat to them as a people, if you like. Putin had actually encouraged that sentiment himself in the early days. Early days means about May. He'd encouraged that kind of sentiment, making all sorts of threats, actually sought the authority to intervene militarily in Ukraine, and had warned against any attempt to persecute the ethnic Russians of eastern Ukraine, because they're part, if you like, of the Russian world, I think he put it. That raised expectations, and certainly on the part of the separatists in the east, who formed a couple of people's republics, so-called. I think they even stuck Soviet on the front of it at one stage, which gives you a bit of an idea of perhaps where their thinking is. Nevertheless, having expected Putin to step in and support them, Putin did not do that. Putin has not done that. That's quite critical, I think. Putin raised expectations, but has not come to the party with real military support. And in fact, he repudiated the declaration of independence by the Donetsk, so-called Donetsk People's Republic. And if anything, that in particular, I think, is in itself a critical fact that Putin has really been all along through this process, despite the image that we have of Moscow as a sort of den of iniquity that doesn't fit the democratic ideals that Western leaders at least like to refer to. Putin's response all along has been fairly defensive in the face of a looming military threat, as he sees it, of an immediate threat. but at the same time, and for that reason, Russian security is paramount for a state like Russia. But at the same time, his primary concern, though, is stability. The idea of little states popping up, especially in a country, for example, that crushed Chechens by brute military force, the idea of what is still in many respects a one might say a multinational country, Russia itself, the idea of actually inflaming separatist sentiments rather than maintaining the state system as it exists at this stage, including the Ukraine itself, I think that is primary for Putin. So on those grounds alone, he was accused by separatists of betraying Russian ethnic interest in Ukraine, betraying the Russian world, if you like. I think I might stop there. I think you've been listening for long enough, but just to say that the civil war that we see going on now, of course, is a dangerous situation, exacerbated by the shooting down of the MH17. It's increased, for example, sanctions on Russia and so forth from Washington. But as yet, I don't see, despite even this process going on, that's the movement of the NATO towards the east, I don't think we're on the edge of a second world war, or at least a third. At least I hope so. But this is being recorded, so I should be careful. Okay, I'll stop there.
We have about 10 minutes, perhaps a few more for questions, which I'm sure you could. Yes, please, Linda.
Thank you all three speakers very much. Very, very informative. It seems to me that the issue of the Crimea being ceded to the Ukraine in 1954 is an important issue here. And I wondered if any of you could provide a bit more background to that and how, what is now basically Eastern Ukraine had until very recently been part of Russia or the Soviet Union or whatever. Does anybody have any background to how that happened and how Sebastopol remains a Russian port within the Ukraine? I mean, I think anybody know anything about that?
Okay, so let me say a few words and then perhaps others my colleagues might to jump in there. Okay, so Khrushchev unilaterally actually gave Crimea to the Ukrainians, perhaps to celebrate the 300th anniversary of what was the but it's also suggested that perhaps he was trying to satisfy it's on the back, of course, in the wake of the death of Stalin. It's always easier to do these things after Stalin died. But he may well have been satisfying the Ukrainian industrial and elite interests within the nomenclature. I have to confess, I haven't looked very closely at that question. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia made an agreement whereby really they were allowed to maintain that base, and they did so on the basis of by paying a large sums of money on a regular basis to Ukraine to keep that base open. So they maintained access to it on that basis. And they had, by the way, they had a legal agreement that allowed so many Russian troops to be deployed there. So there was a legal basis to that agreement, which of course at the time not a lot of that was made in terms of public commentary about the fact that Russian Russian Federation troops that were there on a legal basis. But I'll stop there if you want to add anything.
Just very briefly, 2 points. Firstly, firstly, before 1917, nowhere was part of the Ukraine. Okay, because there was no Ukrainian state. That's the first thing observation I'd make.
So, in that sense, those parts that have only recently become part of the Ukraine in terms of the East, well, they were separate, provinces under Russia. The second point I would make is, even if you look at the 1917, at that stage, the Ukrainian nationalist movement didn't really imagine the Crimea as part of the Ukraine. And the last point I would make is that those republics within the Soviet Union were there very much as a kind of way of killing off the nationalist issue. So they had very little administrative function and absolutely no defense or military function. So to assign the Crimea to the Ukraine was in many ways a tokenistic and meaningless action. It wasn't giving up the Ukraine the Crimea in any sense.
And did it also include those other provinces?
They
like
were
Donetsk?
already part of the of Ukraine. Yes, yes, they were already part of Ukraine from
So it was just
1917.
Crimea that was sort of seen
Yes.
as inadequate.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think can I just add the point that the essential point of this, in many respects, Ukraine is a modern construct.
Sure.
That it's still, which is still being fought over in terms of what it represents.
Okay.
Just as the indigenous Crimean Tatars, were they displaced in 1944?
They were moved out by Stalin in very large numbers because some of them collaborated with the Third Reich, with the Nazis. So that was the justification for their movement. Remembering this is a period of time when Stalin is engaging in massive movements of population. So it's in that context. And although, and in practicality, their return was very greatly limited until the 1980s. So, yeah.
Where were they moved to?
Central Russia.
Sorry?
Central Russia.
Kazakhstan.
And
I think,
population replaced by Russian?
yeah, predominantly in
Predominantly
with
replaced.
in terms of because of the military development there, and also because of the resorts and things like that. It was a popular holiday place for the Nomenclatura as well.
I can say that when the Russians I encountered, when they saw the Crimea had come back, as far as they were concerned, also thought, great, we could go on summer holidays there as well.
I wanted to thank all of the speakers very much for what you had to say. And Roger, I just wanted to take your dealing with the last period. I wanted to go back to what Alan said in the first place, that you really have to look at the role of the British in what has been waged against Russia all along. And also, you can't look at what's happening today without taking into context the global financial situation, which of course is behind the European issue and trying to get Crimea to join with the European Union and the economic sanctions. What you have is a grouping of nations that are working now completely against this bankrupt financial system. And this was emulated at the BRICS summit, where you had all the South American countries, Russia, China, even France was part of backing up Argentina against debt that's, to this international cabal. What Russia understands is that this is very much a deliberate progression towards them, because if you think in terms of financial crisis, re-establishment of empire, that also means the elimination of any nation and their threat to that empire, which is where Russia and China come into this, and the whole build-up towards war and confrontation is Russia and China are the enemy. And they're the enemy because they're grouping, and they're the potential to take away that financial power that today is centred in London and Wall Street. And something that people might like to know is that last week in Congress in the United States there was a resolution that was passed, 370 to 40, for that the United States cannot go to war in Iraq in these cases, but hopefully it will extend to others without the consent of Congress. Because up until recently you've had the two last presidents acting, literally using their own executive powers and going against the will of the Congress, not even asking the Congress for consent.
Sorry, I'll just have to ask you, do you have a question for the speakers, please?
Well, I suppose, what do they know in that? What do they think in terms of, I mean, it's all very well that we talk about these building up of events, but what can we do to, shape and add from Australia in a sense to what is actually taking place internationally?
I think it's an excellent comment, and I'd like to reinforce it by saying that I think we have to stop altogether in the West thinking about modern Russia as equivalent to the USSR. Communism is dead, not quite dead, but dying in Russia. It's been outflanked and defeated by a succession of democratic processes. And people in the West still go on about Putin being a former KGB officer or some such nonsense. The best thing about his being a former KGB officer is that he was a young man stationed in Germany and he speaks German fluently. That might come in handy because he can at least speak to the German Chancellor in her own language.
Yeah. Do we have any more questions? Yes.
How important is the valve that controls the oil and gas for Putin to Europe?
The valve. The fact that Russia has been such a big supplier of gas, in particular, to Western Europe and to Ukraine, it's obviously a very potentially powerful weapon. And from time to time, Putin has, or at least the Russian administration, have exercised that option in terms of getting their way, either in Ukraine when it's usually been as a result of the conflict with Ukraine, but that can also affect gas supplies to, for example, Germany. And one might note, though I don't put everything down to the supply of gas as an explanation for Germany's actions, but you might note that Germany has in fact been quite reluctant to actually confront Russia, or to identify completely with whatever's being said in Washington or even in, let's say, Sweden or wherever. So in that respect, it has been an important instrument in terms of projecting, I don't know whether there's a term for this, but anyway, one might call it gas power, I don't know, using this as an instrument for foreign policy. But it also should be noted that I think it was round about the time that all this crisis was erupting, Russia signed, I think, one of the largest, if not the largest, contracts for the supply of gas with China, which goes on for years to come. It's worth a lot of dollars, rubles or euros, however it's counted. It's an immense resource for both China and Russia for varying reasons, but it also shows, in fact, how Russia, which at one stage, by the way, did, Putin made overtures to even possibly cooperating with NATO, but Russia has really been driven to really find, I suspect it's a natural home, given the nature of the state and its historical origins, find an alliance with the BRIC nations, which generally speaking are countries that are on the path to development but aren't the metropoles, if you like, of capitalism and so forth. So Russia has really been pushed into the arms particularly of China, and they've done so in more recent times with a great deal of alacrity.
Quick question for two more, if they're very brief. Paul first.
Well, my question, in fact, was just being answered because Ken asked the question I was going to ask. What happens when the valve's turned off?
Good. Okay, that's good to hear. Just time-wise, Philip.
A very simple and a very short question. Is Russia arming the rebels?
Yes, I thought somebody would answer that. Okay, that's certainly the accusation, isn't it? I can't say definitively no. It may well be that, in fact, it's highly likely that arms have been going across the border into Eastern Europe, into Eastern Ukraine. Whether they supplied them with a Buk anti-missile system, that's open to dispute. But having said that, that there's a possibility, in fact a real possibility, because there have also been, let's call them volunteers, there may have been special units going across in the early days of this conflict, but just this week, Foreign Minister of Russia, Russia just declared that it wanted a second resolution, and the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov said that, in fact, as part of that resolution, a bit of a surprise to me actually, he wanted OSCE, armed OSCE officers on the border between Russia and Ukraine in order to discredit the notion that Russia in some way or other was providing this flow of arms that's keeping the rebels going. A lot of these people clearly already have significant military training. They've been able to get hold of, I think this is pretty true, they've been able to seize local armaments, to get hold of arms from either police or the military themselves. We know that in fact in the eastern Ukraine, the military, the police in particular, often has not went, because they're ethnic Russians, went over to the side of the rebels. So my short answer is, it may well be true that arms have been supplied by Russia covertly, but I don't think on a scale that in any way gives them the means to seriously now defend themselves against what is actually going on right now, an onslaught which in more recent times included the bombing of Donetsk, which impeded, in fact, the investigation of the circumstances of the crash site in eastern Ukraine. So I can't say definitively no, but I qualify to answer to that as I've done.
Terrific. Okay, I'm going to wind it up there because there is time to informally speak with our speakers when we have a cup of tea. We're all going to cram into our tea room, but please join me in thanking them very much.